Well, good afternoon, everybody. And Chris, thank you for the wonderful introduction. And thank you to the council for having me come talk today. I'm going to talk about building resilience in communities, and this is really important. And it's one that's going to become even more important as we realize the changes we face in communities across the globe. So it's great to be back in Boston. I lived here about 20 years ago. I worked on the Big Dig. And I spent a couple of weeks here a few years back across the river talking with some really smart people about infrastructure development. And the one thing that I learned in Boston, other than how to speak proper English, is that in the 400 years since John Winthrop stood on the deck of the ship and set the tone for American discourse, Bostonians have never let the full discussion of any idea suffer from neglect. So what a better place to have this conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience and infrastructure as well as kind of the built environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate adaptation, but most of what I'm talking about, whether it's climate risks or other risks, it really doesn't matter because we're really talking about how do we prepare, how do we get in front of the curve. And on the climate side, I think we heard from the governor and the secretary about the climate issues. It's interesting, regardless of what you want to have the debate on the causes of climate change. The reality is the climate is changing. It's been changing for the last several billion years. We started out as kind of molten rock, and we got to dinosaurs and a lot of green stuff, and that took about 3 or 4 billion years. But even with ice ages and meteors and all sorts of things that happen, the world is changing. And it's sped up a lot in the last few years, and we need to do something about that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the carbon side of that today. I'm going to talk about the adaptation side, because it's too late for us to avoid the problem, but that doesn't mean we can't do things that lessen the impact, both on the prevention side and on the adaptation side. Let's see if I can figure this thing out. All right. So let's get a little closer to home. Now, it's been about 1 year and 4 months since the storm we call somewhat inaccurately Hurricane Sandy. My friends from NOAA like to remind me that when the storm made landfall in New Jersey, it was technically a post-tropical cyclonic event. Remember that one. So call it what you want. Hurricane, superstorm, the long technical name, it doesn't matter. What you should remember about Sandy, regardless of what you call it, is that it was a huge late season event. There were tropical storm force winds going out 500 miles from the island. It's 1,000 miles across. The picture that was on here in the background is really, it's the satellite picture of the East Coast with that storm in it, and it covers everything. There were 25 states felt the impacts of the storm. 11 from Virginia to Massachusetts had significant damage and were declared presidential disaster. And as Senator Pacheco reminded us this morning, over 100 Americans lost their lives. So I think it's important that we understand the scope of this disaster. Before I get into the recovery and rebuilding side, let me say one thing about emergency response. And that is that it was massive. It began before landfall, and the work by FEMA and all of the response agencies, state, local, private sector, was really just amazing. These people are heroes, and as bad as it was, there is no doubt in my mind that without this coordinated and massive response, the level of devastation and the level of impact on Americans would have been many times greater. And we only need to look at the example from the Philippines last year with Super Typhoon Haiyan, probably the strongest storm ever to make landfall that we know of. And when you looked at the wind speed data from that storm, it looked more like tornadoes than hurricanes. It's just amazing. So back here in the U.S., we've gotten pretty good at responding to severe storms. Luckily, we haven't had to face anything of that magnitude, but But let's talk about recovery. We knew that our real challenge with Sandy was the long-term recovery. And in fact, even before Sandy, we knew that this was an issue. At the beginning of the administration, the president asked HUD Secretary Sean Donovan and then DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano to work together to look at the long-term recovery approach. And the outcome of this collaboration was something called the National Disaster Recovery Framework, or because every federal program needs an abbreviation, the NDRF. And Sandy was really the first big test of the NDRF. And due to the size and the scope of the disaster, we had to ensure that we addressed any issues on the fly. So the president signed an executive order on December 7th, 2012. It created the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, and he asked Secretary Donovan to chair the task force. That brought cabinet-level leadership to the issue. The task force was supported by agency staff from across government, and they even brought in a few folks from the outside like me. It worked at all levels of government and with the private and philanthropic sectors. And last August, we issued a strategy report to the president with 69 recommendations. To be clear, we didn't, figure all this stuff out from scratch in 6 months. We borrowed shamelessly from an incredible wealth of expertise, both across the nation and the world. We talked to the Dutch, the British, the Chileans, lots of other experts from Boston to San Diego. Now, we even borrowed an expert from the Dutch, and let me thank the Consul General and Minister Schultz in the Netherlands. My new best friend at work and colleague, Henk Ovink, is the former Director General of Water and Spatial Planning for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, came to work with us in the task force and is now working with us at HUD. And what Henk often reminds me is that they've made a lot of mistakes in the Netherlands. They've done this for so long, and this issue is so important to them because while 40% of the Netherlands is below sea level, 60% of their GDP is below sea level. And they have a huge threat, and they understand it. But they also have made a lot of the mistakes that we were going to face the same issues, and we should learn from the positive things they did as well as things that didn't work. I actually got a chance. I was on vacation last year and came back through the Netherlands, got a chance to look at a lot of the stuff that they've done. And anybody who tells you that you can't build flood protection into a historic city should go to Amsterdam and Rotterdam and look around. And what you realize is I was getting a tour in the old part of Amsterdam, and I kept saying, when am I going to see the dike? And they said, you're standing on it. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm standing on a street. And they said, come here. And we walked down to a little stairwell by the canal, and he kind of showed me, and you look, and yeah, that street is the dike. They have integrated flood protection into this beautiful city, this historic city, and they've done it in a way that did not detract from it. So it's possible to do it. You just have to think about it a little bit and figure out how to do it. You can get our strategy report online on the HUD website. I hope you get a chance to look at it. Let me highlight a few of the recommendations and findings. First and probably most important is that regardless of the probability of a Sandy type event happening in the mid-Atlantic again, we are at risk from severe weather, and that risk is increasing due to climate change and development patterns. Now, we ignore this risk at our peril. Governor Patrick reminded us this morning, we can argue about climate change until the cows come home, but the facts, the sea is rising, the land is subsiding, and people are living in flood-prone areas. Those are just facts. Now, personally, I'm with the room full of Nobel laureates on what's causing it, but you guys make your own call on that one. I think half of them are from Boston, too. So, the second key finding of the Sandy report is that we can't afford to wait for a disaster to build resilience into our physical and social infrastructure. Look, recovery is a game of catch-up. You've already lost when you start. We need to build resilience into our homes, into our facilities, into our systems before the disaster strikes. When you read the report, and I hope you will, you're going to notice a lot of similarities between our findings and the recommendations and what's included in the President's Climate Action Plan, which was also released last summer. This is not by accident. The two efforts were actually coordinated, and a lot of the same people working on them. And many of our recommendations made sense not just for the Sandy region, but also for cities and towns across the entire nation. So on November 1st, the President issued another executive order, this time to implement the adaptation sections of the Climate Action Plan. This created a federal council and a task force of state, local, tribal, and territorial officials to help guide this process. I know a couple of the folks in the room are involved with that task force. There are, let's see if I get the numbers right, 8 governors, a bunch of mayors, and I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but at the state level there are 8 governors. I think 3 from the east, Vermont, Delaware, and Maryland. And what we have asked that group is, what can we as the federal government do to help you address these issues? Where can we cut red tape? Where can we harmonize programs? Where can we provide you technical assistance? I didn't mention money in there. Look, I don't have to tell you guys about the fiscal realities, but it's not about new money. I mean, we heard that earlier today. It's about looking at everything through the resilience lens, spending the money in the right way. You might not need more concrete and steel. You can use green infrastructure, natural system. There are all sorts of things. Maybe you just put something somewhere else, or maybe you don't put it there at all. And we also created a single flood risk standard for federal agencies that recognizes climate change. All federal agencies funding the Sandy recovery adopted this minimum standard, which was best available data plus 1 foot of freeboard for near-term sea level rise. But understand that's a minimum standard. We know that many assets are at greater risk, and you need to put more science and more engineering and more thinking into how you do that. What was great about Jamie's presentation was, here's a municipality, and New York City's the poster child for this. They started long before Sandy. The Mayor's Panel on Climate Change, Plan YC, leading into the SIR report, they did this the right way. And the work that New York City did actually helped New York City, as bad as it was in Sandy. Had they not started this process earlier, they would have had more damage and they would have had more issues recovering because they didn't have as much information. So we're now working with all of our agencies at the federal level. We've developed a set of what we call infrastructure resilience guidelines to help try to harmonize the programs as best we can at the administrative level. You know, there are a bunch of other projects that are going on with the Park Service and the Corps of Engineers, DOT, HUD, EPA, and we're applying those guidelines to try to drive resilience into everything we do. We're also looking at these guidelines from a national perspective to see if they have the same applicability outside of the Sandy region. And that's a policy process that's going on right now. So HUD is managing a large portion of the Sandy funding. FEMA's going to pump out a lot of money when you consider flood insurance and all their other programs. But at over $15 billion, the Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery is the single largest program funding Sandy recovery. And we've incorporated these guidelines into the requirements for the CDBG program. The second tranche of CDBG funding that was announced late last year has a requirement for the grantees to do comprehensive analysis, to do this with some transparency, to look at green infrastructure, to coordinate their projects regionally, to use performance metrics, to use financial incentives. They have to do these things in order to do it. And because the CDBG funds are also used as local match for other programs, these requirements are actually driving other federal spend as well. Let me talk a little bit about innovation, which is another of our recommendations. we've partnered with several philanthropic partners, and we've launched this international design competition. Jamie mentioned it. I'm not going to talk a lot about Rebuild by Design because there's actually a couple of the teams are presenting this afternoon and are going to give you a lot more detail on it. But what I will tell you is that there were 148 team submissions. We selected 10 finalists to move that forward. Those teams talked to communities, looked at issues, developed an approach, kind of narrowed their thinking down to a project, and in the next couple of months they're going to complete the designs on those projects, and we are going to select some of those projects for funding. Now it's a little complicated because the funds will actually be granted to the state or city or town that is actually sponsoring the project. But this process is an integrative way to bring experts from all over the world to these problems. If you are a small community and you have one little project, you're probably not going to get 148 international teams to bid on it. And so we've tried to use the America Competes Act to stimulate a lot of interest, and it has been really great. I mean, you're going to hear more about it this afternoon. In green infrastructure, both, this provides support both for the adaptation side, but also for the carbon side. This one's tough. Everybody understands the value of green infrastructure except for the accountants. And so here's the thing. We have cost-benefit rules for federal funds, and they're important. And the problem is not that these projects are not cost-effective. The problem is the way we count value needs to change. And so we need to reinterpret. We may need to change the rules, and we may need to interpret them differently, but we have to count those externalities. There's a fancy term, ecosystem service benefits. In reality, what we're talking about here is not just the ability of it to absorb energy from the storm, but to provide clean water, clean air, recreation, beauty. Those have value. We spend a lot of money building parks and cleaning water and cleaning air, and we're not counting that in the oyster bed or the artificial reef or the wetland, and we need to do that. So we got to get ahead of the curve. We don't want to be in that loser's game. And we have to build forward-looking resilience to everything we do. We have to ensure that the money that we spend on resilience is targeted. It's really valuable money. Every dollar we spend on the front end saves us $4 on the back end after the disaster. So there's a cost number here. Let me show you a graphic. This is actually from the work that Jamie and the team did. You guys probably can't see this very well, but so the x-axis here is the probability of the event. Everybody's heard about the 100-year storm, which is really a horrible thing as a term because it confuses the heck out of everybody. It is a 1% chance on any year. It's kind of like throwing dice. If you throw snake eyes, it's a 1 in 36 chance. If you pick up the dice and throw them again, it's a 1 in 36 chance. It's the chance of it happening that time. So on the far right here, these three dots, the yellow, the orange, and the blue, that's the 1 in 70 chance storm for New York City. And this is the cost in asset damage and economic loss from that event. And the yellow line is today. And so today it's $19 billion for that event. In the 2020s, it's $35 billion for that event. Same event, move forward 15 years. And by 2050, it's $90 billion. Okay. Sea level rise, climate change, development patterns. These things become more expensive. We cannot afford to wait. Now, for the non-wonks in the room, here's even a scarier graphic. I'm serious about this. It's lunchtime, Avocados, right? It's a fruit, not a vegetable. It's healthy fat, all that good stuff. The Mexican food chain Chipotle came out with their annual report this week. In it, they gave a warning to investors that due to climate change, heat in California, drought, they may not be able to sell guacamole. Okay. Now this is hitting home, right? Seriously, forget the chart. This is what's important. Look, you can take my house, you can flood my office, you touch my guacamole at your own peril. Don't kid around about that. So another of our recommendations was really to take these guidelines and really look at them nationally. And we're doing that in concert with the President's Climate Action Plan. Now, I'm going to share a secret with you. I hate PowerPoint. I think it's a crutch. We put these word slides up there and then we read them to you. And so what you've seen is pictures and stuff, right? But I'm going to break my own rule here with 2 slides, mostly because I'm lazy. The first one is what the National Academy of Science calls a need for a culture of resilience. And what the bullets on this slide tell you is really the pillars of how that change has to happen. The tipping point of, how we make resilience a new baseline. So people think of it as not as a thing, but as a lens in which we look through things. Secretary Sullivan said it this morning about, it's not always about more concrete and steel. It's a thinking about how we design with nature. Part of this needs to be providing better tools and metrics. Better data and tools for state and local decision makers. You guys are the ones who are going to make these changes. It's not the federal government. This is about planning. And what I really appreciate about Jamie's presentation is here are some folks who are thinking about this at the local level. I had an opportunity to meet with Joan Fitzgerald, who I think actually had to leave from Northeastern yesterday, and talk about this issue of metrics and how do we actually count this stuff so that we know what we're doing and we can actually put some rigor into this. And I'm excited they're starting a new effort to do that. We're going to try to be supportive, figure out how we can be part of that. There are also some things going on the federal side with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Look, this is a shift for us to be proactive on these things. But it's consistent with what we can do. I mean, it's consistent with how we work as Americans. The last slide is actually a quote from the president, so I'll leave you with that one. Because, we can shape the future. We can do what the moment demands. It's going to take all of us. And if there's one thought that I can leave you with, I hope it's that we must change the way we think about resilience and plan and build for the future, not the past. We must make resilience a given in all of our efforts. It's not something we think about later, because later already happened. We can do this, but it's a whole of nation response. It is not the federal government, it is not the state government, it is not the local, tribal, and territorial governments by themselves. It is not, it's the philanthropic sector, it's the private sector, it's academia, it's all of us together. So I hope we can all work together and support each other in this, because this is how we will get through it. Thank you for listening today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.